So welcome to this workshop on thumbnail sketching landscapes, which sort of follows on from the first workshop in the series, which was about scouting the landscape and taking photographs. So we're going to be working from photos for this workshop, but the principles that we learn ideally would be applied while you're actually outdoors. So we're going to be trying to kind of imagine that even though we're using photo references, it's sort of as though we're outdoors while we're working. Thumbnail sketching is a really good way to sort of explore possible compositions in a 2D form before jumping into paint. So it's sort of the very first step you might take, trying to kind of judge whether or not you want to pursue an image. Following that, we would then do tonal studies or color studies, and we'd maybe ideally, if we went outdoors, do something like sort of 10 to 20 thumbnail sketches from different locations, and also multiple sketches from the same location, so you can sort of explore whether a horizontal composition works better than a vertical composition or a square composition, so on. And also the placement of different features within the box. All those sorts of things you can explore really quickly with thumbnail sketching. So a thumbnail basically is just a really tiny drawing. So when we say thumbnails, it means they're maybe not quite as small as an actual thumbnail, but they're small little boxes that we work within. So maybe something, at a minimum, something like this sort of size. At a maximum, a thumbnail maybe would be sort of that size, which is about sort of 2 inches across, something like that. And what's quite good usually when you're doing thumbnail sketching, actually I've not actually gone into the materials, which are pretty straightforward, but just some paper, sort of sketchbook or paper like I've got on a board here, various types of pencils, so I've just got a kind of graphite stick and then a mechanical pencil. I think this one's a B, and the mechanical, the stick is probably about a 2B, something like that. But anything between a 4B and an H will be fine, but you can use pen, you can use pencil, you can use biro. Pretty much any type of sort of drawing media will work. You can use brush as well, like brush and ink works. The same principles will apply regardless of the medium. And then if you are using pencil, you want some sort of eraser is useful as well. We probably won't be using the eraser a lot because the idea behind these are they're quick sketches, not something that you have to refine to a really precise level. But when we get to the sort of tonal stage of thumbnailing, it can be useful to have the eraser to be able to kind of lift things and kind of add a little bit of glow into the sketch. So when getting ready, it can be useful to just sort of put a bunch of different boxes onto your paper. So maybe some tall boxes, maybe some very tall, some more standard portrait boxes. And you can do all this freehand like this. You could do very wide boxes if you wanted to test out sort of super wide compositions. So you can see I've got a bunch of boxes drawn out there now. So these become the little sort of boundary boxes for our thumbnail sketches. The first type of thumbnail that you can do is a super simple line sketch. So one way of sort of testing out a composition, it's quite dark, this one, but it's the one with the little pokey rock in the set that you have sticking up, and then you can sort of see some hillsides behind and a little bit of a sunset. So one way of testing a composition out initially is just to do a very simple line sketch, breaking the composition down into just the most basic sort of line armatures that you can find. The most obvious will usually be any kind of very strong contrast. So in this one, the hillside here is a sort of sloping diagonal, slopes down to the left. and it contrasts quite strongly against the sky. There are a couple of secondary lines. There's a sort of, in the distant hillside you can see a sloping line that cuts back down across, almost kind of intersects at an opposite angle. And then the light shape that runs across the distant horizon, that's pretty much horizontal. The only thing that really fully breaks that up, or breaks through that, is this pointy shape that sits in the middle. So if we were to do this as a line drawing, we could test this out in, let's say, these 3 boxes. So we could see what it looks like as a square composition, what it might look like as a tall composition, and what it might look like as a wide composition. So for this sort of standard kind of typical horizontal rectangle, that's our, say, quite low down, we might have one line that goes across this angle, which captures that kind of angle that slopes down to the left. Another that captures that bit of hillside in the distance that drops down. And out of that, probably just 2 lines will then capture that little rock that sticks up. So I'll zoom in a little bit for these 3. Otherwise they're a bit tiny to see how they're looking. So that's just 1 line, 2 lines, 3 and 4. And it kind of gives us a sense of how this might break down. It's a very, very simplified version of what we're looking at, but it's a good way to kind of start testing things out. So if I put it into the next 2 boxes, we can sort of see how the same composition might look in a different setting. So again, if we're placing it, we'd have to kind of decide, do we want a lot of the landscape below? Probably we would keep the rock in because it's one of the more interesting features of the landscape. But do we want the rock really high up and just a little bit of sky, or do we want the rock low down and quite a lot of sky above it, or do we want it central? Again, this sort of thing you could break down into 3 versions of the same thing, where you put it low, you put it in a midpoint, you put it in a high point. But let's try, because it's quite a tall composition, we've got quite a lot of kind of stuff going on below the rock. We could try the same thing, but this time we put it up here, that hillside behind, and then the rock above. And given that there's now so much space below, we could possibly drop in just a couple of extra lines. Sort of catches that heather versus the grass next to it. And so then it starts us sort of thinking about how that relationship works. And finally, I'll try it in the bottom box, but this time I'll do it really low down, so we just see just the top of that hillside, then again the distant hillside that slopes down, and the rock that juts up. And each of them has quite a different feel, so it's the same subject, but it's arranged or composed totally differently. And so in this way we can start to explore possible compositions. So it allows us to make kind of sort of decide how we're going to compose the piece before we start our study in paint. So that's where they're useful. What we can do, even without adding a great deal of detail, we could then transform this into a tonal sketch. So a very simple tonal version of this would be to just lightly go over the distant hillside and then the near foreground in each of them. So that way we're separating out the land from the sky, which is the major major tonal difference in the piece. The sky is very bright and the land is very dark. Although in this instance, because of the I'll tilt across a little bit, but because this hillside is so far away and it's quite a misty day, that hillside is sort of merging into the tone of the sky, so it's maybe kind of like touch and go whether you would turn that little bit of land in the distance into a value that groups with the sky or a value that groups with the land. But for this one, we'll try with the land. Conceptually, obviously, you would feel that the land should group kind of together and then the sky would be separate, but the mist does sort of disrupt that. And then We could then go darker, add another tone by going darker than the misty hills in the background. Do that on all of them equally. And a final tone we might pop in is the rock's a bit darker and the heather than the grass. So then just by doing that, we start to kind of get a better sense of the different compositions. It's a little bit easier to see than the line drawing, but the line drawing is a very quick way to test stuff out. But in this way, we start to get a much better idea of the sort of value composition that's going on in that particular subject. If we wanted to we would maybe then pick one that we want to develop. So I maybe prefer this one, I would say, out of all three. So after exploring them, that's the one I would choose to sort of pursue. And having picked that one, I can maybe go in now and start to add some more variation into the shapes. So rather than keeping it simple, I could quickly sort of add extra darks where necessary. Start breaking up the simpler shapes, those straight lines that I started with. And then maybe add a little bit of a gradient into the sky as well. In that way I start to merge part of the sky a bit with that landscape, the misty landscape. And if I wanted to try to catch a little bit of sense of that glowing portion of the sky, I'm going to have to push all the values down a little bit elsewhere.
What do you mean by the values?
So the sort of how light or how dark the tone is. So value is whether it's moving towards black or moving towards white. So if I was to say a low value or a dark value, that would be, say, this little rock here. If it's a light value, it's the white of the paper. And value, the sort of limits of value is dependent on your medium. So working in graphite, I have fairly kind of limited value range. I can only go as dark as the graphite, the pencil can go. If I go really dark with it, that's about the kind of maximum value that I can reach. Charcoal would go a bit darker than that, and then paint will go even darker. So oil paint, ivory black oil paint is about as dark as you can possibly go, and then titanium white paint goes pretty light, but white paper also is quite light. So the two extremes are the white of the paper and then how dark I can possibly go with my pencil. So this is a dark value and this is a light value, and anything in between is a sort of like a half tone or an intermediate value. So if you say make the value darker, you're kind of moving towards black, and if you're making the value lighter, you're moving towards white. So if I wanted to lift the value a little bit, what I've done is I've done just a general pass over the whole drawing in pencil, so that there's some tone everywhere, and then I'm going to use this eraser just rolled to a point and just use that to lift some of the pencil, and then just add that highlight running through the sky. So between all that stuff, we've pretty much got a sort of reasonable simplified version of that piece if we were to go in and actually start painting it. Maybe I could do a little bit more, kind of balance out these rocks on the left, so it felt a little bit kind of unbalanced because this edge didn't really have anything dark and the right hand edge has a lot of dark. So sort of analysing it, that might be a bit of a failing in this composition. It sort of feels a little bit too dark and heavy on this right hand side without anything to balance it out. But there are in the references these rocks on the left hand side, so we could try to play up some of those rocks, find some dark shapes and notes within them. Last week we were talking a little bit about can you make stuff up or move stuff around, and this would be an instance where you could those rocks that are on the left hand side, I maybe shift them across a little bit just so they can fit into this composition. It doesn't really do any damage to the rest of the composition to do that, but it creates more balance than I had originally. So if I zoom back out, you can sort of see having that little grouping of tone on the left hand side balances out the tone on the right hand side. Whereas without them it does feel a little bit lopsided. As I kind of push the tones darker generally, it started to feel more and more lopsided. So generally that's the sort of the approach, or the way that you can use thumbnailing at its most basic level. We're going to do some slightly more sophisticated thumbnails as we go, but I'm going to go through this stage a few more times with different subjects. So doing the same sort of thing, just filling up a few boxes, starting with a sort of wireframe, sort of line drawing, and then adding some tone, and then developing one of them a bit further. And so it's sort of like a method of narrowing down what you want to work from. When you go out into the landscape, there's so many possible options, and it's hard to know what's going to work well as a landscape painting. And this is one way to kind of start to get a feel for it. Feel for the landscape. It's sort of like a warm-up to a certain extent before you start painting. You might only spend sort of 10 or 20 minutes doing thumbnail sketching, but it's a good way to kind of explore different parts of the landscape. Having to sort of look at them even for a few minutes does sort of start to shift how you might feel about a landscape, and some things might suddenly stand out as a really good option for working from. So
got a quick observation, that is, I've struggled with these in the past.
Yeah.
Considering that they're quite simple little studies. But I think it's because in my mind I've always assumed it's intuitive composition.
Yeah.
But I can see just from tonight, actually, when you start to just draw any part of the landscape, even if it's just a thumbnail, you're starting a conversation with it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it does help focus what's of particular interest to you.
Yeah, definitely. That's sort of the main purpose of them, really, because they're absolutely not anything anyone would ever see, but they allow you to explore different possibilities, and they're a bit of a warm-up to a certain extent, but they definitely serve a function in that they get you, they allow you to kind of sort through compositions. They're very useful if you're working outdoors for practicing finding boundaries as well, so being able to kind of frame inside an image, which sometimes can be tricky. Thumbnails are a good way to practice that because they're so small. People often have trouble trying to fit the whole image into a tiny box, and they sort of want the box to be bigger, but you can try to kind of train yourself to limit which feature's going to go where at the edge of the box, and get used to constraining stuff when you're working outdoors, because it's a lot harder to work outdoors when you have a sort of full 180 degree view that your eyes see, versus a photo that's already framed the image in for you. So That's why I'm with the thumbnail sketching with these photos we're using as references, rather than just copying the whole photo across and fitting it into the same size box.
Yeah.
I'm trying to do it so that we sort of crop inside that image, so you're getting used to that idea of cropping.
Yeah, well, that's very true. That way, even when you just take a photograph, you see something that really captures your interest. You take a photograph, and suddenly there's something in the middle of it that you hadn't seen. So it's good to sort of just be aware of exactly what it is in front of you that you're interested in and how it would work.
Yeah, and where balance is coming from as well. So, like I said with this one here, where it wasn't necessarily unbalanced as a line drawing, because these two lines kind of crossed each other, but once I started to put tone in and I made the right hand side so dark, it then started to feel a bit unbalanced because it was so dark tone heavy in this shape here and so light on the left hand side, that I then felt I would need something to balance it out. And there were those rocks which would have to be moved across a little bit in the final composition, but they're there to help balance it out. So it sort of helps you to explore that, and you sort of see where something might look really good when you look at it, and then where once you start to put a box around something you're looking at, it changes, because then it becomes this sort of abstract composition where you've got tone and color and value all in the image together, and you're trying to figure out how do they balance in a purely abstract sense, and not even anything to do with what is it you're looking at, but is it a nice kind of really basic image. The most extreme example of that is Mondrian started with landscapes and ended up with his absolutely completely abstracted designs, but they're still based around the idea of a landscape and how it balances and where you put colors and boxes, and any image has that abstract pattern to it as well as a naturalistic thing that you're looking at, whether it's a landscape or a person.